Almost in the same year, 1521, when Montezuma's empire was demolished and the Anahuac subjected to Spanish domination, African slaves began to arrive in Mexico, brought to the newly conquered land by masters whose sordid greed was not satisfied with the gold and silver that the country's natives could extract from their mines. The Mexicans, either for their aversion to their conquerors, or perhaps due to their own good customs, did not want to give themselves over to the work of the mines with all the tenacity and constancy that the Spaniards wanted. Emperor Charles V had been informed of the excessive work to which the Mexicans had been condemned by the conquerors, and this had produced more or less serious sedition and uprisings, all of which could have fatal consequences for the crown of Spain. He ordered with the audience of his counselors and theologians that the Americans should be free of all bondage, annulling the Indian divisions that Cortes had made. From this came the Spaniards' need for African slaves, who were working day and night in the mines, received a miserable retribution, and were considered as animals who could enrich their owners rapidly. Indeed, the number of blacks brought to New Spain was so large and so great were the profits they produced for their masters that by the year of 1527, Charles V, among orders he sent to Mexico, provided that married blacks could redeem themselves by paying their masters 20 gold marks, and in proportion could redeem children and women. Initially, the slaves were employed only in the labor of the mines, but soon they took up the planting and cultivation of sugarcane, a plant that some authors claim was taken to the islands of America from the Canaries by the immortal Christopher Columbus, and which Cortes had transplanted into Mexico. By the year of 1608, the number of black slaves was so large in New Spain that there was hardly a single wealthy family that did not have many of them in their service. Although the situation of the indigenous people in America was very tough because of the hard and inhuman treatment they received from the conquerors, it was nevertheless sweet compared to that of the unhappy African slaves. In those early years, horses, mules, and oxen were very scarce in New Spain, and the work of these animals was supplied by black slaves, whose strength and vigor were summoned by their handler's whip. Those men necessarily thought about freedom, not only because love of freedom is innate to the heart, but because they fled the barbaric treatments to which they were exposed all and every day. To be rescued, according to the ordinances of Emperor Charles V, which we have spoken of, was almost impossible. They needed for this all the gold they could possibly gather with the assiduous work of their entire lives. Then they turned to think of what was natural. New Spain was covered by thick, unexplored forests. Its ferocious land could be cultivated with little work. The jungles were formed in many parts of trees whose fruits could sustain a man and his family. The mountains were free. Even the wild beasts living in their grottos were happier than the black slaves of the Spaniards. And from those immense deserts, the fugitive offered independence to the beings converted into slaves by civilization. The blacks realized that beside the town of the colony were the jungles inhabited by the deer and the wolves and the snakes, and that alongside the bondage and the whip were God, nature, and freedom. And the slaves of mines, of the houses, and of the sugar mills began to flee into the forests. Such were things in the year 1609, when the Viceroy D. Louis de Velasco ruled New Spain. It was the night of January 30th, 1609. The moon, lost on the horizon, barely lit the white snow of the magnificent Pico de Orizaba, known among the natives by the name of Zitalpec, and the shadows surrounded the fertile valley of Acuozingo. It was the night of January 30th, 1609. The moon, lost on the horizon, barely lit the white snow of the magnificent Pico de Orizaba, known among the natives by the name of Zitaltepec, and the shadows surrounded the fertile valley of Acozingo. Among these shadows, the rumor of the trees, stirred by the night winds, was barely audible amidst the murmur of the streams descending the mountain slopes. However, an attentive listener could discern, in the midst of those confusing noises, other sounds, not produced by the winds or waters. They were human voices, undoubtedly from the march of a large group of men. Wow. They were human voices, undoubtedly from the march of a large group of men who walked hurriedly conversing with each other, breaking the weeds and shrubs that opposed their passage. The march of those men was uninterrupted, and the group seemed to walk in the direction of the place now occupied by the city of Cordoba. When the first reflections of dawn began to color the sky a splendid pink off the coast of Veracruz, the group of men that had crossed during the night by the Orizaba Pass made their way climbing a steep slope. It was a troop of blacks, strangely dressed and armed. Some wore silk stockings all torn to pieces, others squires' trunks with dirty stockings and leather breeches. One wore an embroidered satin doublet, and another a curate's mink sash. One covered his bare shoulders with an elegant cape, another was wrapped in a cassock, and somebody else was wearing a corseted vest with slashed sleeves, while the one furthest off dressed in a fleecy herald's cape. It all seemed like a masquerade, and one could make sure that those outfits were the spoils taken from the passengers on the road from Mexico to Veracruz. As for the weapons of those men, it was curious to observe that there were among them Aztec bows and arrows, arquebuses and swords of the conquerors, sledgehammers, spiked macana clubs, slingshots, axes, shotguns, wailing lances, daggers, halberds, and in all the greatest disorder and confusion. Next to a black who was sporting a big knight's lance on the shoulder and a quiver full of arrows with his bow across his back, walked another with great confidence with a crude indigenous war club hanging from his fancy, his swordman's harness, and holding up in his hand a heavy matchlock arquebus, an armament that seemed the product of a partial plunder. That strange troop must have been composed of more than 100 men, and at its head, with all the air of a general-in-chief, walked a tall, well-built black man of muscular features, who dressed with more propriety than the others, and who was also better armed, showing a shiny steel breastplate, a long rapier in its sheath, and holding a good shotgun. Climbing through those rugged paths and through narrow and dangerous gorges, the troop finally reached a spacious plateau that topped one of the highest mountain ridges. A black camp was located there. It was the headquarters of all the slaves who had fled the cruelty of their masters, seeking the freedom they were ready to defend with arms and at the cost of their lives. The arriving force had been seen from far away. The whole camp had moved, and men and women were rushing to receive it. In the midst of all of them, an elderly but robust black man stood out, one whom everyone looked to with deep respect, and who seemed to be the patriarch of that errant tribe. When the newcomers entered the camp, the soldiers disbanded without waiting for the order of their chief, and mixed up among the groups awaiting them, and only the one who had come at the head went in search of the elder. "Good morning, Francisco," said the old man, holding his hand to the other with a paternal air. "God keep you, Father Yanga," Francisco replied. "What news does my son, Francisco de la Matosa, bring to me?" "Bad news, Father Yanga, bad news." "How so? Have some of our brothers died?" "No, the whites want our death. Yesterday I was presented with a brother who, like me, is from Angola, and left Puebla to tell me." "To tell you what?" "That an expedition comes from Puebla against us, led by a captain of that city, calling himself Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera, and departed on the 26th day. We are a 30-day march away. They must be coming very close now. Such I believe, and that is why I have doubled my efforts to have all the troops ready and prepared for combat. Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera brings 100 Spanish soldiers, 100 adventurers, 150 indigenous archers, and about 200 more among mulattoes, mestizos, and Spaniards who have gathered around him. That would amount to 550 men, many people, in truth. But no matter, God will help. How are they coming? They have not followed any set path, and they come by missing paths. Are there watchmen everywhere? Yes, and it's impossible to get closer without being sensed. There comes one running now. He must be bringing news. Doubtless of the arrival of the enemy. Put your people to their weapons, and I will go to meet the watchman. The old man went out to find the one who was arriving, and Francisco began to arrange his troops. The work was not great, and at one point 400 blacks were formed, all armed. Yanga returned. Francisco, he said, it is necessary to write to this Pedro Gonzalez. What for? Francisco asked strangely. To tell him that we will obey God and the king, that we want our freedom, and that if he gives it to us, if he does not return us to our cruel masters, if he allows us a town of our own, we will lay down our weapons. Do you think this is right? Yes, Francisco replied. And who will carry that letter? The Spaniard we have as a prisoner. An hour later, a Spaniard left the black camp, carrying a letter from Yanga, leader of the uprising, to Captain Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera. Old Yanga was the spirit of the revolution, which he had simmered for 30 years, and Black Francisco de la Matosa was the battle general, appointed by Yanga. The black people were already waiting for the signal of the battle. The troops of Captain Don Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera had walked many days, and were camping on the banks of a mighty river and in front of the positions occupied by the blacks. This happened on February 21st, 1609. The two enemy camps could be observed, and the two small armies were preparing for combat, which undoubtedly would come the next day. Gonzalez's soldiers had in their favor numbers, discipline, and the quality of their weaponry. Those of Yanga were confident in the strength of their positions and the justice of their cause. The night came. Little by little, the contours of the trees and the mountains faded into the dark background of space, and then it was nothing but a dense and mysterious fog, in the middle of which there was no distinction other than the distant light of star-like bonfires, or the faltering clarity of some stars that shone like bonfires. Heaven and earth were confused between shadow and light. Then it could be noted that in both camps they moved the troops and got the combatants ready. Yanga and Francisco de la Matosa arranged the defense. Don Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera was preparing the assault. The first dawn of the morning would certainly give the signal of attack, and God would give victory. So it happened all night, and throughout the night there was certainly not one of those hearts which now more than 2.5 centuries ago have stopped beating forever, unmoved by the danger of the next day. The dawn finally shone, and the columns of assailants set into motion amid the bleak silence. Don Pedro Gonzalez was at the head of them, trying to encourage his soldiers with his example, but in front of him one of the soldiers' little dogs was walking. That animal did not know that all those men among whom his master was going walked into combat and death, and therefore he played among the weeds, running out in front, and then scampering back to find the column that continued moving forward without resting. Don Pedro looked at him almost without thinking, but suddenly he noticed that the animal, which had run out ahead of them, had suddenly stopped, like he was frightened, and started barking in agitation. An ambush, Don Pedro shouted, understanding what the dog's behavior meant. An ambush, those who followed him repeated, and the column suddenly stopped cold. The captain unsheathed his sword, waved his hat, and with a strong voice summoned his troops. Santiago and Spain closes. At them, he repeated, and the whole column began to climb rapidly up the cliffs in the direction of the ambush discovered by the dog. The blacks knew the ambush would no longer really work, and went out to intercept their steps. Then the fight was fought. The musketeers began firing their weapons on the blacks, always gaining ground, and the blacks were firing on the assailants with the few firearms they had. They tried to make them flee or to stop them by rolling a large number of rocks that they had been preparing for this purpose. But nothing stopped the bravery of the assailants, who climbed and climbed, always gaining ground, and showered their enemies with a real rain of bullets, stones, and arrows. The battle lasted for many hours, and fate favored the soldiers of Don Pedro Gonzalez, who by the fall of dusk had seized the positions of the blacks, but not without leaving the whole way they had traveled planted with corpses and the wounded. Yanga and the others who accompanied him, seeing that it was impossible to resist any longer, fled for the forests, leaving nothing in the power of their enemies but a few corpses. That was a triumph, but a triumph both ephemeral and costly. The blacks who fled would become strong again elsewhere, and a new battle would be necessary, which would give the same result as this one had given. To conquer by force of blood a position that would have been abandoned shortly afterwards, and with the fear of finding it defended again the next day. And this was a campaign as painful as it was sterile in its results. The blacks had lost some people, but their compensation was that the same had happened to their persecutors. The proportion was perfect. Don Pedro Gonzalez de Herrera understood all of this, and he wanted to take advantage of the moments of victory and give another front to the campaign. So he offered a pardon to Yanga and his people. Nail leaflets with this offer everywhere on the trees, send up white flags on all the heights, and at last Yanga wrote to the viceroy. Yanga proposed a parley, in which there was a lot of concession. They proposed not to have intended to offend God or the king, of whom they were loyal vassals. They committed themselves to deliver henceforth all new fugitive slaves to their owners, in return for remuneration, and they asked for a town in which to live with their children and women, and in which they would receive the priest and have a justice that they would name. The viceroy agreed to everything and granted them land to form the town that was called San Lorenzo. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, the alarm had been great, and the viceroy, to calm the climate, had publicly whipped some blacks who were imprisoned for various crimes. With this it seemed that everything had ended, and indeed, in that trust, the years passed until 1612. In this intermission, Don Luis de Velasco, the viceroy, had been called to Spain to take a position of great importance in the court. The Archbishop of Mexico, Fray Garcia Guerra, succeeded him in the government of the colony, but it lasted very few months, because one day when he climbed his carriage, he could not take the steps well. He fell, and because he was very old, he died of the fall. The Archbishop Viceroy died, and the royal court took possession of the government, and the Dean of Judges, Otalora, moved to the palace of the Viceroy. He had barely begun to govern when he spoke again of the uprising of the blacks, and the people were terrified. 1,000 alarms, or rather 1,000 extravagant tales, circulated through Mexico City and its neighboring towns. The names of Yanga and Francisco de la Matosa passed from one mouth to another, pronounced in horror. Somebody was sure that in one of the forests on the road from Mexico to Veracruz, there was a camp in which blacks were counted by the thousands. Someone said that during the cold nights of February, mysterious troops hovered around the cities like an army of ghosts evoked by conjure. Some others affirmed that when all the inhabitants of Mexico slept, from the terraces of their rooftops they had seen bonfires in the surrounding mountains that could be no less than passwords, and had heard the wild howls of the liberated blacks. All of this was believed, and it all gave room to say that the black slaves of the city helped by the liberated, were planning to rise up and had even set themselves a deadline for the uprising on Thursday of Holy Week. The governing court stoked that fear, and security measures began to be enacted that would have no effect but to increase the fear. As the uprising was to be verified on Holy Thursday, the processions and feasts of Sacred Week were suspended, and in all those days the prayers of the night were not heard in the streets by a single passerby. By chance, on Holy Thursday at midnight, a herd of pigs entered Mexico City, and as all were apprehensively awaiting the terrible event, the first to hear the squeals of those animals figured they were the voices of the blacks entering the city and spread the alarm, and that alarm was so great and so frightening that panic seized all the neighbors, and no one dared to leave his house to make sure of the truth until the morning of the next day. In these flailings, all of the Holy Week of Easter was spent. It cannot be safely known whether the royal court actually discovered any conspiracy, or perhaps simply wanted a dramatic spectacle to calm the mood and to threaten the blacks in case they thought of rebelling. What is certain is that just after Easter, Mexico witnessed one of the most horrific executions in memory. 29 black men and 4 black women were executed on the same day and hour in the city's main square. The crowd was immense, filling the square and the streets. Along the balconies and rooftops, everything was full. There were spectators gathered everywhere, awaiting a terrible massacre. The scene was capable of striking Nero himself with horror. Those men, and especially those women who walked near moribund and covered in rags to the gallows, to find death after a life of slavery and suffering, the confessors who at a wounded cry entrusted those souls to the mercy of God, an immense multitude that was as agitated as a drunken sea, and over all these heads 33 gallows, from which they hung 33 souls within the hour. The execution was over, but people were not retiring, and from there awaited a still more repugnant second act. The executioners began to lower the corpses, and with an axe to cut off the heads and mount them atop long poles. Corpses were being punished, and the decomposed blood of the dead was being shed. That scene was disgusting. The 33 heads were fixed on poles in the city's main plaza, with all the ornate dignity of the greatness of the royal audience. For a long time, those trophies of civilization hung there, until the royal court, found it no longer possible to suffer the fetidness, and had them removed and buried. And this is how that dream conspiracy was suffocated in the year 1612.